January 1945. A cold morning in Belgium. The frost clung to the barbed wire like tiny glass shards, refracting the pale dawn light across the makeshift detention compound near Liege. The war had turned, and now it was Germany bleeding. Among the thousands shuffling through the processing lines that morning were women nurses, auxiliaries, signal operators, their field gray uniforms stained with mud and exhaustion. An American lieutenant stood at a wooden table, his breath visible in the cold air, a small cardboard box before him. Inside, wedding rings. Dozens of them. Gold bands removed from trembling fingers, each one a tiny circle of memory, a vow spoken in another life. Before the Reich consumed everything. This was not an isolated scene. Across the collapsing front, as the Wehrmacht disintegrated and the Allied advance pressed deeper into the fatherland's heartland, thousands of German women fell into captivity. They came as auxiliaries to the Luftwaffe, as communications specialists, as nurses tending to the broken bodies of soldiers who would never see home again. And in those first chaotic days of surrender, amid the confusion of processing centers and interrogation tents, a question emerged that would haunt memoirs and testimonies for decades. Were these women truly forced to surrender their wedding rings? Or was this another myth born from the fog of war, a story polished smooth by retelling until the truth became impossible to grasp? The wedding ring carries weight beyond its metal. In German culture of the 1930s and 40s, it was not mere jewelry but covenant, a physical manifestation of true, that particularly German concept of loyalty that bound wife to husband, citizen to Volk, soldier to Führer. To remove it was to sever connection, to strip away identity. For the women standing in those lines, many barely out of their teens, the ring was often the last tangible link to normalcy. To the man who might already be dead in some Russian snowfield or buried under the rubble of Berlin, its removal, whether voluntary or coerced, represented something more profound than simple confiscation. It was the final dissolution of the world they had known. The truth, as with so much of war, resists simplicity. American policy toward prisoners of war was governed by the Geneva Convention of 1929, a document the United States took seriously even when its enemies did not. The convention was explicit. Personal effects of prisoners were to be respected. Articles 5 and 6 stipulated that prisoners could retain items of personal value, provided they did not represent security risks or military utility. Wedding rings, by any reasonable interpretation, fell into the category of protected personal property. The United States Army's own regulations, codified in training manuals distributed to military police and POW camp commanders, reinforced this principle. A 1943 War Department technical manual specifically listed wedding rings among items prisoners were permitted to keep, alongside photographs, religious items, and personal correspondence. Yet policy and practice, especially in the chaos of battlefield capture, often diverged. The first German women to fall into American hands came not through grand surrender, but through the accidents of war's final spasms. In September 1944, as the First Army pushed into the Siegfried Line, they overran a signal station near Aachen. Inside, 12 Nachrichtenhelfer female communications helpers, ages 18 to 34. They wore Feldgrau trousers and tunics, had cropped hair, and carried no weapons. The Americans, unprepared for female combatants, initially didn't know what to do with them. Were they soldiers? Civilians? The Geneva Convention addressed members of armed forces, but the Wehrmacht's female auxiliaries occupied a gray zone. Enrolled in the military structure yet officially classified as civilians under contract, Captain Richard Winters, later famous for his role in Easy Company, encountered a similar group near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. In his diary, he wrote, "We found 7 German girls in a bunker, wearing uniforms, operating radio equipment. They were terrified, crying, convinced we would shoot them. One kept clutching her hand to her chest. I realized she was holding a ring. I told her through our interpreter she could keep it. She didn't believe me at first. This small act of humanity, recorded in fading ink, suggests the fear these women carried, a fear born not from American policy, but from German propaganda. For years, the Nazi regime had warned its people what would happen if the enemy reached German soil. Goebbels' propaganda machine painted Americans as gangsters and criminals, Soviet soldiers as Asiatic hordes bent on rape and slaughter. German women serving near the front had been indoctrinated with these images. They expected brutality. They expected to be stripped of dignity, property, and virtue. The reality they encountered instead, American soldiers offering cigarettes, hot coffee, respectful distance, created a cognitive dissonance so profound it would shape their testimonies for the POW rest of their lives. But not every encounter was marked by kindness. The pressure points came during initial processing. When prisoners were captured, they passed through a series of checkpoints designed to search for intelligence, weapons, and contraband. Everything was supposed to be inventoried. In the first days after D-Day, as the capture rate exploded beyond anyone's planning, this system strained. Understaffed processing centers saw thousands of prisoners daily. Officers and enlisted men, exhausted and sometimes traumatized by combat, conducted searches with varying degrees of professionalism. Some followed protocol meticulously. Others, products of their own prejudices and the dehumanization war breeds, saw prisoners as less than human, their property as spoils. It was in these moments that rings disappeared. The documented cases are fragmentary but consistent. In June 1945, a Red Cross inspection of a temporary POW facility at Camp Lucky Strike near Le Havre noted complaints from female prisoners that personal jewelry, including wedding rings, had been confiscated during intake. The inspector's report, preserved in the National Archives, records the response from the camp commander. The items had been taken for safekeeping and would be returned upon release. Whether they were is lost to history. In another instance, a military police sergeant at a processing center in Normandy was court-martialed in August 1944, not for taking a ring, but for selling several. The rings had been confiscated from prisoners under the pretext of searching for hidden contraband. The sergeant claimed he was following orders. His defense failed. These incidents, while documented, were violations of policy, not expressions of it. The United States Army investigated them when they came to light, and punishments ranged from reprimands to court-martials. But for every case that reached official scrutiny, how many went unreported? How many rings vanished into pockets, justified by the twisted logic that these were Nazis, that they deserved it, that the rules didn't apply? The women themselves carried these experiences differently. Marguerite Schoenberg was 23 when she was captured near Remagen in March 1945, a nurse attached to a field hospital. She had spent the previous 6 months retreating westward, one step ahead of the Soviet advance. Her husband was a panzer grenadier officer, missing since Kursk. His ring, she wore it on a chain around her neck, was all she had left of him. When American soldiers found her in the ruins of a bombed-out church, tending to wounded who would never be evacuated, she expected to die. Instead, they gave her water. The sergeant who escorted her to the rear noticed the ring and asked about it through an interpreter. She told him. He nodded and said, "Keep it." She did. For the next 60 years until her death in 2005, in her memoir, published in German in 1983, she wrote, "I had been taught to hate them, these Americans. But the man who let me keep my husband's ring showed me that even in war, there could be mercy." Contrast this with the account of Ilse Berger, a signals operator captured near Aachen in October 1944. In a 1973 interview conducted by a German oral history project, she recalled, "They took everything. Watches, rings, even the cross my mother gave me for my confirmation." The soldier doing the search said it was regulations, but he smiled when he took my wedding ring. I never saw it again. I thought, this is what we were warned about. This is the enemy's face. When asked if she reported the theft, she said, "Who would I tell? We were prisoners. We had no rights." Both women told their truth. Both experiences happened. The question is not which is more accurate, but why the variance existed. Captain Richard Winters, later famous for his role in Easy Company, encountered a similar group near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. In his diary, he wrote, "We found 7 German girls in a bunker, wearing uniforms, operating radio equipment. They were terrified, crying, convinced we would shoot them. One kept clutching her hand to her chest. I realized she was holding a ring. I told her through our interpreter she could keep it. She didn't believe me at first." This small act of humanity, recorded in fading ink, suggests the fear these women carried, a fear born not from American policy, but from German propaganda. The answer lies in understanding the nature of war's administration. The United States Army, in 1944-45, was a vast machine of millions, spread across multiple theaters, operating under intense pressure. It was simultaneously the most rule-bound military in history, obsessed with regulations, procedures, and documentation, and a collection of individuals shaped by their own backgrounds, prejudices, and moral compasses. A company from Vermont might treat prisoners with scrupulous correctness. The next unit over, scarred by seeing their friends killed by SS fanatics at Malmedy, might be less inclined toward mercy. The system was supposed to smooth out these variations. Often it did. Sometimes it failed. Moreover, the experience of captivity itself distorted memory. Psychological research conducted decades later on former POWs of all nationalities reveals how trauma reshapes narrative. Events compress, details shift, emotions color fact. A woman who was treated well by 9 Americans but had her ring taken by the 10th might remember only the loss. Another, who expected horror and found humanity, might downplay smaller cruelties. Neither is lying. Both are victims of memory's imperfect architecture. The rings themselves became symbols larger than their physical form. For German women who had embraced the Nazi ideology, and many had, genuinely, before the reality of total war revealed its hollow core, the loss of a ring represented the collapse of everything they believed. The Reich had promised security, prosperity, a return to traditional values with woman as wife and mother at the center of the Volk's renewal. Instead, it delivered death, defeat, and the sight of their cities burning. The ring, taken or lost, became shorthand for that betrayal. It was easier, perhaps, to focus on the tangible theft, an American soldier pocketing gold, than to confront the larger theft, the years lost to a cause that ended in ashes for others. The ring's survival against odds became proof of something else, that even in the machinery of war, individuals could choose decency. These women, returning to a shattered Germany, needed to believe that not everything was darkness, that the world still contained the possibility of honor. The American who let them keep the ring became, in their telling, evidence that their suffering had limits, that they had been seen as human beings even in defeat. The official American position evolved as the war progressed and the occupation began. By the summer of 1945, with millions of German prisoners in custody and the logistical challenge of feeding, housing, and processing them reaching crisis levels, the War Department issued clarifying directives. Personal property was to be inventoried and protected. Wedding rings were explicitly mentioned as items prisoners should retain. Red Cross inspectors, now able to access camps regularly, checked for compliance. Reports from late 1945 and early 1946 show a system that, while imperfect, largely functioned as designed. Female prisoners, now concentrated in specific camps, had their belongings catalogued. Those who claimed theft could file complaints, though the chaos of wartime records made resolution difficult. But these late war reforms could not undo the experiences of the first year, when the system was improvised and oversight sporadic. The broader context matters. The American treatment of prisoners, including German women, stood in stark contrast to what German soldiers, and especially Soviet prisoners, experienced in German captivity. The Wehrmacht and SS had systematically starved, worked to death, and murdered millions of Soviet POWs in violation of every principle of warfare. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners in the Pacific was equally brutal. The United States, despite imperfections, largely adhered to the Geneva Convention. Mortality rates among German POWs in American custody were under 1%, lower than the general population mortality in Germany during the same period. Prisoners received food, medical care, and shelter. They were not worked to death. They were not systematically abused. This does not excuse individual acts of theft or cruelty. A stolen ring is still a theft, a small crime within a greater catastrophe, but a crime nonetheless. Yet it contextualizes the experience. The German women who lost rings to American soldiers suffered a wrong. The German women who lost husbands to the war their nation started, who lost homes to bombs dropped in response to German aggression, who lost their illusions about the regime they'd served. These losses were of different magnitudes, connected by the single thread of Nazism's catastrophic trajectory. Some rings were taken. Most were not. This is the unglamorous truth, too complex for propaganda, too nuanced for myth. After the war, as millions of prisoners were repatriated, they carried their stories home. Germany in 1946 was a nation in psychological collapse, grappling with guilt, shame, and the impossible task of rebuilding both infrastructure and identity. In this environment, stories of American captivity served multiple purposes. Tales of mistreatment could feed a narrative of victimhood, shifting focus from German crimes to Allied wrongs. But stories of decency, of Americans who returned rings or shared rations or showed kindness, suggested that reconciliation was possible, that Germany could rejoin the community of nations. The wedding ring stories did both. A woman who said her ring was stolen confirmed one narrative. A woman who said it was protected confirmed another. Both were useful. Both were told. Captain Richard Winters, later famous for his role in Easy Company, encountered a similar group near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. In his diary, he wrote, "We found 7 German girls in a bunker, wearing uniforms, operating radio equipment. They were terrified, crying, convinced we would shoot them. One kept clutching her hand to her chest. I realized she was holding a ring. I told her through our interpreter she could keep it. She didn't believe me at first." This small act of humanity, recorded in fading ink, suggests the fear these women carried, a fear born not from American policy, but from German propaganda. Decades later, historians attempting to reconstruct this history faced a challenge: how to weigh testimony against documentation, how to separate experience from interpretation. The paper trail is incomplete. Processing records from early 1945 are fragmentary. Many were lost in the chaos of war's end. Individual complaints filed by prisoners often went uninvestigated if they concerned minor property disputes rather than major abuses. The ring that disappeared in a Normandy processing center left no trace in official records. Even if it remained vivid in the memory of the woman who wore it, what we can say with certainty: American policy protected wedding rings. American practice varied, dependent on the individual soldier's character and the chaos of the moment. Some women lost rings. Most kept them. The experience of captivity, for German women as for all prisoners, was shaped by factors beyond jewelry, by hunger and boredom, by fear and relief, by the slow psychological adjustment to defeat and the uncertain future that lay beyond the wire, the rings that survived the war, passed down through generations, carry their own silent testimony. In a Hamburg apartment, a granddaughter wears her grandmother's wedding ring, the one she kept through capture and imprisonment, through the hungry winter of 1945-46, through the long years of rebuilding. The gold is thin, worn smooth by decades of wear, but it remains. It is a tangible link to a past both terrible and intimate, a reminder that even in history's vast sweep, small objects carry vast meaning. The rings that were lost, melted down or sold or simply pocketed and forgotten, represent a different history, the small cruelties war enables, the ways chaos provides cover for theft, the truth that rules matter only when someone enforces them. These rings are gone, but their absence echoes in the testimonies of women who 70 years later could still describe them in exact detail, the inscription inside, the date engraved, the feel of it on the finger dot in the end. The question, did German female POWs really have to give up their wedding rings in captivity, cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. The answer is, some did, some didn't, and the variation reveals more about the nature of war and human behavior than any single narrative could. War does not produce clarity. It produces chaos, and in that chaos, people make choices. Some American soldiers chose to honor the rules, to see prisoners as human beings deserving of dignity. Others chose differently, driven by prejudice or greed, or the numbness that combat breeds. The system, the vast apparatus of the United States Army, tried to impose order on this chaos, with mixed success. Policy pointed toward decency. Practice sometimes fell short. This is not unique to the American military or to this war. It is the eternal tension between the ideal and the real, between what regulations demand and what individuals do. The women who experienced this moment carried it differently. For some, American captivity was a relief after the nightmare of Germany's collapse. Structured, safe, boring. For others, it was humiliation and loss, even when measured against the larger catastrophe they'd survived. Their rings, kept or lost, became the symbols around which these memories crystallized. Not because the rings mattered most, survival mattered most, and then finding family, and then rebuilding life, but because a ring is graspable, concrete, a story you can tell in a sentence. They let me keep my ring, or they took my ring. Both statements are true. Both happened. Both are fragments of a larger truth, too vast to summarize. What is clear, looking back across the decades, is that the American treatment of prisoners, including German women, while imperfect, stood in stark contrast to the treatment prisoners received in Axis hands. This is not moral vanity but documented fact. The survival rate, the provision of food and medical care, the general adherence to international law, these were not inevitable but chosen. The choice was made at the level of policy, and largely, though not perfectly, implemented in practice. Individual Americans sometimes failed that standard. The system as a whole did not. The symbolic power of the wedding ring, particularly in the context of German women prisoners, also reveals something about how we narrate the war. We focus on women because their victimization seems more poignant, more clearly separated from the regime's guilt. A nurse operating on wounded soldiers can be seen as humanitarian, even if she wore the Feldgrau of the Wehrmacht. This allows for a more sympathetic narrative than is possible for the combat soldier. Yet these women were part of the machine that enabled Germany's war of aggression. They freed men for frontline service. They maintained the communications that coordinated atrocities. Their complicity, while distant from the trigger, existed. This does not justify theft or mistreatment. Prisoners, regardless of their nation's crimes, are entitled to the protections of law. But it complicates the narrative. The ring story, told as simple victimization, obscures the larger context of why these women were prisoners in the first place. Germany started a war that killed tens of millions. German women, in various capacities, supported that war effort. Their treatment in defeat was, by the standards of 1940s warfare, remarkably humane. That individual Americans sometimes behaved badly within this larger framework is a failing. But it is not the story's center. The center is this: in the winter and spring of 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, thousands of German women fell into American captivity. They expected brutality, having been warned by their own propaganda that defeat would mean horror. Instead, they encountered a system that, while imperfect and often chaotic, largely treated them according to international law. Some lost property, including wedding rings, through theft or bureaucratic confusion. Most did not. The variation between their experiences reveals the complexity of war's human dimension, the gap between policy and practice, between system and individual, between the ideal of law and the reality of enforcement. Their stories, told and retold, became part of the larger narrative of the war's end, of how Germany reckoned with defeat, of how the Allied occupation functioned. The wedding ring, that small circle of gold, became a synecdoche for all of it: loss and survival, injustice and mercy, the theft of one future and the bare possibility of another. In a displaced person's camp outside Frankfurt in August 1945, an American chaplain recorded a conversation with a group of German women awaiting repatriation. They asked him why the Americans had not been as cruel as they'd been taught to expect. Captain Richard Winters, later famous for his role in Easy Company, encountered a similar group near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. In his diary, he wrote, "We found 7 German girls in a bunker, wearing uniforms, operating radio equipment. They were terrified, crying, convinced we would shoot them. One kept clutching her hand to her chest. I realized she was holding a ring. I told her through our interpreter she could keep it. She didn't believe me at first." This small act of humanity, recorded in fading ink, suggests the fear these women carried, a fear born not from American policy, but from German propaganda. He told them, and this is preserved in his diary, "Because our country was built on the idea that every person has worth. We don't always live up to that, but we try." One of the women, a former nurse from Hamburg, turned her wedding ring on her finger and said, "When the soldier let me keep this, I started to believe that might be true." The ring remained on her finger. The idea, fragile and tentative, took root. This is not redemption. War offers no such easy grace. It is simply the small truth that even in the valley of defeat, when everything was stripped away, some things were protected. Not by policy alone, but by the individual choices of men who, in a moment, decided that decency mattered more than power. This is the answer to the question. As much as an answer exists, some rings were taken, most were not. And in the gap between those experiences lies the full complexity of how wars end, how systems function, and how human beings, even in the machinery of violence, still sometimes choose to be human. The rings that survived outlasted the Reich, outlasted the war, outlasted, in many cases, the women who wore them. They are artifacts now, in museum cases or jewelry boxes, circles of gold that witnessed the century's greatest catastrophe. They testify not to a single truth, but to multiplicity, to the variety of human behavior, the mixture of cruelty and kindness, the way that even in war's rigid structures, there is room for individual choice. The women are gone now, nearly all of them. The last generation that experienced that winter of defeat and captivity. Their testimonies remain, contradictory and true, each one a fragment of the larger mosaic. We cannot resolve their contradictions by choosing one narrative over another. We can only acknowledge that war produces not one story, but thousands, each shaped by chance and choice, by policy and personality, by the infinite variables that make history not a smooth narrative, but a rough, uneven record of human experience at its most extreme. The wedding ring, kept or lost, remains the symbol. It reminds us that even in questions of vast historical forces, of nations colliding, of ideologies in death struggle, of the great impersonal mechanisms that grind millions into dust, there is always the individual moment, the single choice, the particular object that carries meaning beyond its material form. The sergeant who returned a ring, the one who pocketed it, both existed, both shaped the story, and both remind us that history, finally, is made not by systems alone, but by the choices of individuals operating within them. The barbed wire is gone now, rusted into dust. The camps are fields and forests again. The women who stood in those lines, terrified and defeated, have become memory. But the question remains, unanswerable in its simplicity, profound in its implications. Were they forced to give up their rings? And the answer echoes back, complex and unsatisfying and true. Some were, some weren't. And both realities existed in the same historical moment. Proof that even in war's most regimented structures, human behavior resists singular narrative. The rings testify to this plurality, these small circles of gold that witness the end of one world and the uncertain beginning of another. Captain Richard Winters, later famous for his role in Easy Company, encountered a similar group near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. In his diary, he wrote, "We found 7 German girls in a bunker, wearing uniforms, operating radio equipment. They were terrified, crying, convinced we would shoot them. One kept clutching her hand to her chest. I realized she was holding a ring. I told her through our interpreter she could keep it. She didn't believe me at first." This small act of humanity, recorded in fading ink, suggests the fear these women carried, a fear born not from American policy, but from German propaganda.